welcome back to Cine-Mess, Embracing Bad Cinema. I'm Jess.
I'm India.
And today we have a special guest. We have Millie Morris from the Exeter Communications Department here to talk to us about Miss Americana.
Hello.
Hello, thank you for coming on.
No problem. It's great.
We knew that once we knew that you were going to come on to the podcast that we wanted to talk to you about something related to Taylor Swift because you've done a lot of research on her as like a sort of icon of the music industry, all sorts of things. You went to a conference to talk about Taylor Swift herself, so we were really excited to hear your opinions of it. But just a quick question, are you a Taylor Swift fan?
I am a Taylor Swift fan, but I think that I have a bad habit of kind of doing academic research on things that I enjoy and then I end up hating them. So I've said that I absolutely will not do any research on Poldark, which is like one of my favourite shows because I'm an 80-year-old woman. But I am a Taylor Swift fan. I'm going to see her in Edinburgh in June, but I'm also I think I have like two parts of me, the Taylor Swift fan and then as an academic doing research on Taylor Swift, and the celebrity text of Taylor Swift is slightly different to being a fan because that's where you kind of think about the discourses surrounding Taylor Swift through a critical lens and a nuanced lens, and you contextualize Taylor Swift within structures of kind of whiteness, heteronormativity, romance, capitalism, climate change, because she's flying a private jet every 3 seconds. So, yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's an interesting combo. India, are you a Taylor Swift fan? Have you ever been a Taylor Swift fan?
No, I've never been a Taylor Swift fan. Have
you been a hater or just neutral?
No, just neutral. I don't like her music.
You just never been into it?
No. But like obviously I know some of her songs. But when I was watching the documentary, there was only like one song I recognised and I felt really bad because like everyone knows Taylor Swift and then there's just me.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to escape Taylor Swift nowadays, I think. I used to be a big Taylor Swift fan when I was like 12, like Shake It Off era. I ate that up. I love the music video. 2012, 2013, it was a great time for Taylor Swift. Recently, I haven't really followed her over the years. I think she's become a really discussed topic in pop culture, especially recently. And I haven't seen any of her documentaries, specifically Miss Americana. If you haven't watched it, it takes place from around the 2018 Reputation tour, am I correct, up until the release of Lover. And the film itself released in early 2020, so just before the pandemic. And it is an interesting film in that I wasn't expecting it to be so sad.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on it. I think that what were your thoughts on it, watching it?
I think Indy and I, we talked briefly before this. I think we have different opinions on it.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I liked it.
I didn't like it.
I loved it.
Interesting. Oh. That's very interesting.
Which is kind of interesting because I feel like you're not someone who has really been exposed to much Taylor Swift content.
No, and I don't think I weren't the target audience either because I'm not a big Taylor Swift fan. But it just really drew me in. But I love documentary films, so...
That could be it. Because I guess the way it's set up, it's supposed to be a sort of insight into her life, the hard parts of being a celebrity, being lonely or, having everything being scrutinized, this idea that she's built her happiness upon pleasing other people, which is sort of, I guess, the message of the film. She's learning to love herself for who she is, but it felt like a very constructed sort of narrative.
I completely agree with you, and I felt like the bits where it almost got interesting, that they could have gone so much deeper. I wanted to know about, the scene, and I have a lot of thoughts on the music essentially I felt like it was a kind of a promotional piece of content for the Lover album.
Yes, because it released around the time the album was coming out.
Yes, yeah. And that album is that's my least favourite album, which is quite controversial, I think. But it's my least favourite album because I felt like it was quite symbolic of her kind of gripping onto this very, this idea of youth. And you can see that in the documentary, I think. But, I just felt like it was a promotional for that album. And the bits where, she's talking about her stalkers, and there were moments where I was like, God, I really wanted the interviewer to kind of pry more into that. Like, how has that affected you? Like the fact that you can't leave your house without being absolutely like swarmed by people. It felt very like surface level.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because sort of a similar documentary, the One Direction one, I think actually tackled that more. It did come out a few years earlier, but they do sort of bring up how uncomfortable it makes them feel being swarmed by fans, outside their hotel rooms or their houses. And I feel they briefly touched upon it in Miss Americana, but they never really go beyond surface level.
Yes, I completely agree. I think the one moment where they did do it was when she's talking about her eating disorder. But then, even then, I felt like, and I suppose it's like quite a vulnerable moment, so maybe you don't want to. I felt like that was the one moment actually where it was not a kind of constructed vulnerability. I felt like the rest of it was a little bit constructed for us as the viewer, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So, and I thought that moment was actually quite powerful because I think it was, her body has been kind of disciplined in the same ways that the majority of women's bodies in the mainstream media are kind of discussed through this very like disciplinary lens that's like based on very heteronormative white standards of beauty. And Taylor Swift, I think, was kind of seen as the epitome of that beauty. So actually I thought it was quite interesting because it demonstrated how even that image of beauty is unattainable for someone like Taylor Swift, who may be seen as kind of having attained that beauty and that body. It was still unattainable for her, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. I think that was quite a refreshing part of the documentary that I quite enjoyed, sort of her reflecting on this image that's been constructed and acknowledging that she sort of put it together over the years and how that might impact herself. But she doesn't really look at, like you said, how that image has been sort of seen in the public as well. I mean, one thing I think that I wish they had sort of focused on more was the impact on her as entering the industry as such a young artist. I mean, they bring up the moment where Kanye West interrupts her speech as a pivotal moment for Taylor, something that really harmed her self-confidence, that sort of she struggled with for years. And I wish they sort of focused on a bit more of her being so new to the industry, perhaps as a young artist. I mean, she really blew up when she was it 16, 15? 15, so quite young.
I never knew about the whole Kanye West thing.
Really?
No, so I'm watching it going, oh, that's actually really sad.
It is.
I was like, why? Why would he do that?
I think that, and you know what? It was that moment was really used as kind of like a lightning rod for racism in the US.
Yeah.
So I can't remember the scholar, but there's a really interesting article that's about the ways that he just received like a torrent of racist abuse and kind of the imagery of this, and I'm not necessarily saying this is Taylor Swift's fault at all, but that imagery of the young white woman having something taken away from her by the, quote, scary black man was kind of weaponized by the right-wing media.
Yeah.
And how, I don't know, I just felt like, and I completely think that, and of course he's not without blame because he's turned into a actual fascist now, so but yeah, I think it's really insightful. I just felt what you just said, Jess, because I think that there were lots of moments where I thought the interviewer should have said, oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because for a documentary, you didn't really feel the presence of an interviewer.
But I like that.
Which can be quite nice for sort of slice of life, but I think that meant we missed out on moments where perhaps we could have gotten more information or like a deeper understanding.
But for like a documentary point of view, documentary filmmaking, I don't know if you guys, do you watch a lot of documentaries or?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't watch documentaries on like pop stars or anything like that, so this was really new for me. I kind of just watch documentaries, like a lot of war documentaries. Which I'm quite interested in, and mainly a lot of like travel documentaries, that kind of stuff. But this was very, very, very different. But from a sort of, I felt we got these intimate kind of moments, but they felt a bit staged. Do you know, they didn't feel real. And when they started to become real, it was then just like, no, next part of the documentary goes on. But I still like the documentary. I would have changed that. And if I was, if I was a cameraman or camera person following her, I think I would have pushed some of the topics a bit more.
I think that's a really good point. And can I tell you my main gripe with the documentary? I hate the fact that we're getting this insight into her as a songwriter. And this is kind of like, I suppose, my like fanish self coming in. And then they proceed to show her playing the worst song of all time, which is Me. That is such a bad song. And it's
I like that song.
Oh,
I remember
I'm so sorry.
I remember when that song came out, and I hated it so much because
Yeah.
it felt like the worst songwriting
Yeah.
ever. The spelling is fun kids line. It's
But this I think really speaks to that kind of, and I mean, she says it in the documentary, her trying to grasp onto this idea of girlhood and like remaining relevant amongst the youth, you know, and I think that is like a really great example of how that completely missed. That whole spelling is fun. It just felt like, I don't know, it just annoys me so much because I'm like, I would have loved to have seen the songwriting process for, you know, songs that actually have some depth, but when it just cuts to me, he.
No, I love that.
Oh, I'm sorry, India.
No, but I quote the line, you can't spell awesome without me every day. I love that song so much. It's
Every
amazing.
day.
My favorite, nearly every day.
I do think it's such an interesting song that they chose to highlight, though, because the whole time she's talking about how her main draw as an artist is her ability to storytell through her songs.
Yeah, and then
And
they pick
how
that song.
she feels like that's her personal strength when it comes to making music. And then that's the song they try to show a lot of the progression of.
Yeah.
It felt a little bit unfortunate to me that was the song they chose to focus on.
But maybe they were definitely taking a risk with picking that song to focus on. But I don't know, what other song would they, if you were like you know, if you were filming the documentary, what song would you want her to focus on? If she's saying that her greatest sort of strength, her sort of, you know, as a musician is storytelling.
Well, I think because it's on the Lover album, something like Cruel Summer would have been very interesting, because I think that actually is a song that does have some depth. But on the point about the contrivedness of it, I hope I'm not like jumping around on topics too much. But the one thing that I found like quite irksome, and what I find quite irksome about Taylor Swift as a Taylor Swift celebrity text anyway, is the way that it was kind of propaganda for the brand of Taylor Swift, which is, you know, I suppose to be expected to some extent. But I didn't like the way that, and this is kind of in the subtext, I suppose. I didn't like the way valid criticism of her was conflated with kind of the misogynistic representations of her. And don't get me wrong, I think that within the media she has had a lot of horrible misogyny, particularly around her romantic life.
Yes.
There's, you know, the very famous kind of slide, like, you know, when she was on Ellen and like is like close to tears, and Ellen saying, "Have you dated him? Have you dated him? Have you dated him?" In a really awful, you know, misogynistic, heteronormative way, like really horrendous. However, I feel like with Taylor Swift in general, she conflates this criticism of her. She conflates this kind of valid critique of that criticism with actual valid criticism, such as the fact that she has now reached billionaire status, and I would argue that is inherently unethical, such as the fact that she does fly her private jet 8 minutes.
Yeah.
And has, and you know, and I know that, you know, other billionaires contribute to climate change, Elon Musk being one of them, the Kardashians being other people, you know, Jeff Bezos being another one. But that doesn't change the fact that she does contribute to these issues and she does benefit from these unequal social structures. And so I feel like within the documentary, and I think that I felt like it was hinting at a kind of silencing of critique of her, of very valid critique, and almost rewriting a narrative in certain ways. But, like, for example, with regards to, like, the Kanye West saga, whilst I thought that I love the Reputation album and I think it's actually, like, a real masterpiece and very theatrical and, like, great in lots of ways, she also did play into that narrative in certain ways and kind of rewrite history in certain ways. And I feel like sometimes it all kind of blurs into a her trying to control the narrative around her celebrity text when actually some things are like valid critiques. And that's why the scene about the politics was quite interesting, I thought.
Yes, I thought that was really interesting, especially there's one bit where she and her friends, like in their mansion or something, they all toast to the revolution.
Oh, yes.
Or something like that. And I found that very tone deaf.
Yes.
Just the scene itself, the fact that they say it like multiple times about like, oh, the revolution, when it just didn't quite hit the way I think she wanted it to. And I don't know if that's because it's a few years on from when the documentary initially released. I think if she released the same documentary now, I think she'd get a lot more criticism.
A lot of backlash.
Because I think her sort of celebrity image has sort of shifted a bit in the 3 years since.
I think that's such a... I actually forgot about that scene, but that's such a good point, Jess. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, to the revolution, I'm doing an Instagram post of me in a grey... Sat at the edge of my... I remember the picture. It's like her in grayscale, like sat at the end of her bed, like looking wistful. And it's just about voting for, you know, a liberal politician who's going to enable the same kind of oppressive structures, just in an albeit more palatable way for the rich. Anyway, but yes, I think that that's so true. And I think that it's interesting now how her kind of political stance has gone completely silent. And over the last couple of years, I think she did a very vague post the other day of like, you should vote. And the thing is, I'm always torn on this. And I don't know what I think about it. And I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. I'm always torn because on the one hand, I think that, you know, perhaps it is not... what's the word I'm looking for? Perhaps it's not realistic to expect individual celebrities to have the answers to big social structures on the one hand. And, you know, she did get kind of... People did say... What is your political position? What is your political position? There was a lot of kind of nonsense articles saying that she was Nazi Barbie and like an Aryan princess, and which I think was actually really unfair. But so that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, it does then irritate me how she has not said anything, for example, about Palestine, but then uses feminism as part of her marketing. That is part of her brand. So that and also does contribute to climate change in a very real, very devastating way. Even if you just look at the construction, like how her merchandise is made in sweatshops by women on the poverty line, basically. So I'm interested what you guys think.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting conundrum. I'm always torn on this when it comes to celebrities, actors, whatever they may be. Are they obligated, like morally, ethically, to disclose, let's say, their political leanings? Should you expect that? I think you see this with nowadays too online, where people expect their favorite star to speak out about issues. But are they qualified to? Should they be qualified to speak about that? I think that's a topic I'm never quite sure what side I fit on, if I think they should be required to, or are they allowed to be quiet about issues. But I think if you get to a point like Taylor Swift, where you're such a well-known figure and you at some points you start to benefit from the ambiguity of not saying what your position is on world issues, and by doing so you're actively deciding not to say anything, you're ensuring that you won't lose out either way, which I think can be quite a interesting tactic.
That's so well put, really interesting. And I completely agree with you of the kind of weaponized, I don't necessarily think it is, because it is part of her marketing, that kind of weaponized vagueness that I think you see a lot within liberal celebrity discourse. And I think I would argue on something like Palestine, which is a clear moral issue.
Yes.
I think that I don't know. I do think that she has a moral obligation to say something, but because of the ways that she has previously said, I am a feminist. You know, I think it reveals
Yes.
the kind of limitations of this type of feminism that is about a very specific type of woman. And, you know, seeing feminism through this very narrow lens. But then I also go back and forth. I'm completely with you in that I go back and forth. I'm not sure what's right. I also think it's problematic to... The one thing where I completely agree with a scholar called Driesen, I can't remember her first name, I feel really bad. But she wrote a really great article in The Conversation about when Taylor Swift was dating Matty Healy. And it was about like how this because there was like a whole like Speak Up Now campaign from fans basically telling her to break up with this guy, with Matty Healy, who, you know, is an idiot, but still. I think that what the article was saying is that actually kind of individualizing these big social justice issues is problematic in itself because it doesn't get us to think critically about those social structures.
That's quite an interesting way to put it, especially I think there's an expectation that you want your idol or your celebrity to speak out about the issue in a way that validates your own opinion, not necessarily, you know, to educate others. I feel like I see a lot of that in comment sections nowadays where they want them to say something, but only to sort of validate their own narrative about the artist.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And this article, I can't remember what it's called now, and I can't remember who wrote it. No, Simone Driesen is one of the, and then Annalay Prinz, that I would definitely recommend reading. It's really interesting. But I also, I completely agree with you on that. But I also think for someone like Taylor Swift, who is now stratospheric, is that a word? Stratospheric? Yeah. Brand, like an entity, a huge cultural capital. For me, I've been really torn, particularly around the recent events in Palestine, where I think, but this is actually a kind of fundamental moral issue. And it makes me think about, there's this really great podcast, I think you guys would like, it's called You Must Remember This. Have you come across it?
No, I haven't.
It's about old Hollywood, and they go through different celebrities. They talk a lot about Marilyn Monroe and the ways that Marilyn Monroe, they do a whole like kind of 5-part episode on Marilyn Monroe. And what I find really interesting about Monroe, I'm sure you guys know this as film students, is that what's often erased out of her narrative was how she was a communist and was very politically active. And actually, I think, and that makes me think, you know, I don't know, I feel, as I say, I'm not sure if this is really like making a point. I go back and forth, but I do feel like when you get to the power, it's not just about Taylor Swift as an individual, it's about she is a brand. Yeah. And she positions herself as a brand. And I think, exactly as you said before, there is a kind of relying on ambiguity, relying on the language of go out and vote. And that's not necessarily saying that she has to have all the answers. But I do think, as I say, I would argue that with something like Palestine, I think that actually it's quite revealing. And I found there was this like quite disturbing juxtaposition of what was happening in Palestine, and then all the images of people at the Grammys and people at the Oscars, which I found quite disturbing and sickening, if I'm honest. I just found it like a horrible juxtaposition of this kind of demonstration of absolute wealth and absolute kind of soft power, but which isn't, you know, soft power in inverted commas, of power and of kind of, but actually then on the other hand, kind of devastation and horror. So I don't know, I kind of go back and forth, but I do think that it is a it's an interesting question. What do you think, India?
I think, well, either way, if a celebrity is to voice their opinions on like their political stance, if they're to voice them, they're gonna get backlash. If they don't voice their opinions, they're going to get backlash. You can't win. They can't. And telling people, it's like if they say, vote for so-and-so, blah, 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 this is wrong, this is right. If they've got a younger audience like Taylor, they're going to influence their opinion and they might not fully grasp or understand what actually is happening in the world. So they might just be going, oh, well, Taylor said that, you know, I should vote for this people and blah, 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 and this person's the best and you know, everything you know, they're amazing. I should go and follow them. But in reality, they probably know nothing about what's actually happening.
Well, also, that's not a new strategy. I mean, there's been celebrity endorsements of politicians and vice versa for years. Like, it's not a new thing when it comes to Taylor. I think that it's an interesting topic that comes up, especially recently. I'm kind of relating back to the documentary itself. I thought it was quite interesting how sort of reviews have changed over time. I've been looking through some like letterbox reviews and whatnot of the documentary, and the more recent ones tend to be more negative, like 3 stars and below, which I think reflects maybe how her image has changed. She hasn't. I think it's interesting to see how she hasn't been able to maintain this control over her branding, and in terms of this sort of very clean image. I think especially recently, with her sort of refusal to acknowledge climate change and her personal impact, perhaps, on her negative impact on the climate, I think that's really tainted her image for people because it's a very, how do you say it? I feel like it's not a very divisive issue in the sense that you either believe climate change is happening or you don't. And if you do, you can very clearly see that she is contributing to that impact.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And also, like, and it kind of irritates me how some people will say that is a misogynistic. I've seen, like, the kind of some people making the argument that it's misogynistic to critique her impact of climate change. But like we've said before, she is a brand, and her brand, you know, the way that her merchandise is produced, as just one example, contributes to climate change. The fact that she releases 20 versions of the same vinyl in different colours contributes to climate change, contributes to overconsumption, and kind of is therefore overconsumption. That's the reason why, you know, she produced the Midnight's album, and every vinyl was one part of a clock, and it was so you put it together, and you know it's there to make you buy stuff. And no, I think you're absolutely right that actually, like, it's not just about critiquing Taylor Swift, although I do think that, of course, like, when Taylor Swift is discussed in the media, misogyny does play a part in it. But I also think that it's really reductive to say that to critique her contribution to climate change is inherently misogynistic because she's a woman, because men also contribute to climate change. Well, how about we critique kind of the concept of being a billionaire and how that amount of money is completely astronomical and completely unnecessary and is what is going to kill us all, essentially, you know, to end on a high note. But, like, you know, it's just so interesting. And then with I think with that juxtaposition of her saying, you know, cheers to the revolution, it's just quite funny in hindsight. It's
especially, I saw one comment that was really interesting to me in the fact that when watching the documentary, they realized that the Cheers to the Revolution moment was supposed to be the climax of the documentary, which is quite an odd feeling because you don't, at the end of the day, it was an Instagram post, and you can argue on whether or not that is something that is influential or not. You could talk about that for ages, but I think it brings an interesting point to mind, which is, like, how should celebrity documentaries be made? Especially in the case where Taylor herself was very involved in the construction of this documentary. Like, she picked out the director from a list that Netflix sent to her. So she had, like, a big hand in how it was put together. So I guess the question is, how do you think that, is there an ethical way for celebrity documentaries to be made? Especially if they're so involved in the process?
That's so interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's always going to be about, well, actually, interestingly, I haven't confirmed it yet, but there's a documentary about Taylor Swift that I may be interviewed for over the next couple of weeks. So that'll be interesting to see how that is produced and made, because I don't think she's involved in it. But it's more about her, like, story. I think when they have a hand in it, I mean, I think I would be the same. If there was a documentary about me, I would be like...
Exactly.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, isn't that part of when she's leaving her house, going into the car, and the paparazzi, which I really hate the paparazzi, but but we won't get into that, when the paparazzi are kind of, like, they're trying to quickly get her from her house to the car, and then that's when she like looks at the camera and sort of like has that one sort of less staged, well, we know it's less staged, but less staged intimate moment. But that is the only part in the documentary that feels authentic. And I love the documentary from a point of view where like the cinematography of her performing, I loved all of that. The voiceover and like flicking back to home videos, and I love at the beginning it says this is just like my own home video, no one's ever gonna see this. And I'm like, yeah, well, millions of people are seeing it now. But like, from a documentary sort of making point of view, I thought it was good, but it lacked those intimate moments that shouldn't have been scripted.
Well, I completely agree. I think, and as I say, like I thought that there was just moments where I thought it could have gone, like you say, gone deeper. It felt very like, it just felt like a promotional video for the album for me. And all the politics stuff. Yeah, a bit, yeah.
Literally was, yeah.
And it felt very like, sorry, Jess, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, usually in each episode, we sort of ask 2 questions about the film that we've watched for the week. And the first question is it a bad film? And the second one is, would we rewatch it? But I think I'm going to change it slightly today. Instead of would we rewatch it, is would you recommend that other people watch the documentary? So I guess, first of all, do you think it's a bad documentary? And you can have your own definition of what bad is, but how, like, for example, India, how would you say it's a bad documentary?
I wouldn't say it's a bad documentary. It gets the idea across. It's an insight into her life, I understand, but it could have gone into more depth, most certainly, we just spoke about. But then again, I don't watch a lot. I've never watched a documentary about a celebrity or a pop star before literally last night when I watched Miss Americana. So I don't think I can really judge how, I think from a documentary filmmaking point of view, I'm looking at it from watching war documentaries, which are very, very, very different. So I don't think I could really say if it's good or bad. But the structure, it was just irregular documentary structure. But it did make me. I was gonna cry. I was on the verge of tears a little bit. I don't know why. Didn't like that.
It has the big. Yeah, I completely agree that it has the big kind of. Moments where you think yes, when she's like going to go onto the stage at the end, and it's like that moment of, and then it shows I love all the stuff of like showing her as a young teenager going onto the stage, and then showing her going onto the stage, this stadium full of people. That is really quite something. But I completely agree. I don't necessarily think it's bad. I just think that it was kind of snapshots that could have. The most interesting parts were the kind of off the cuff conversations where you think, like I felt like the director should have off camera, like been like, let's talk about that more. Let's go into that more. Like, why do you feel like that? Like all the stuff around the stalking as well. Like that was kind of like mentioned, like, oh, I have stalkers.
It was kind of pushed to one side as well. Wasn't it when she was with,
Brendan Urie. They were discussing stalkers. He just offhandedly says like, oh, they broke into our house, so we've moved. And I feel like
so
that's such an interesting part that could have been talked about more. Maybe they're not comfortable about it if there's a court case, maybe not. But I think honestly, the director missed out by not trying to sort of push that a bit more.
Definitely. And just stuff around, I think what would have been interesting is also talking about like how she feels about the kind of narrative that has surrounded her about, oh, you only write songs about your exes and I thought that could have been interesting as well, like how she feels that she's kind of reclaimed that through like this idea of storytelling. There was none of that. It was that could have been really good.
I was actually hoping, because we got a few scenes of it, I was hoping we get more insight into her as a songwriter in terms of the creative process, because she does seem to be trying to sort of re-legitimize her image as someone who writes all her own songs, who spends time making these stories that her audiences can relate to. And I feel like with a lot of other moments in this film that I sort of criticize, we didn't get enough of that. And I think that would be something so refreshing to see, you know, breaking down like how these songs actually get made. I thought that was a really interesting moment where she's in the studio working with Jack, sort of talking over, you know, okay, what line do we put here? How do we open up this narrative a bit more? I wish we had seen more of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that I love actually when she released Reputation, she made these like kind of making of videos. She released all these kind of like filmed on the phone, filmed on her phone, just doing like you say, like constructing these songs. And that was really interesting to me. But I think it also goes into the kind of construction that she has built for herself of a storyteller, of someone who does the work, of the craft being her kind of like construction of this like kind of Swiftie verse that's like built upon kind of Taylor Swift lore. This is kind of what my paper looks at, as how she's kind of not dissimilar to someone like C.S. Lewis, in that she's constructed a Narnia, but of Swiftian mythology in many ways. There's a scholar called McGrath who compares the Folklore album to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, because rather than going through the wardrobe into Narnia to escape World War II, people went through her piano in the Cardigan music video to this like other world of like mythology, which really does kind of surround her music. So I think you're right. The focus should have been on that, like how I would have loved to have seen like more of that, like the crafting of her of her music and how and the kind of marketing that surrounds it as well. She did something years ago where she would capitalize the letters of words in kind of the songbook of her albums, and it would spell out a meaning. And so I would have loved to have like just stuff like that where I think that could have been like really interesting. But I felt like it kind of got interwoven with this kind of trying to control the narrative of her celebrity text, which was less interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess with that in mind, would you recommend that other people watch Miss Americana?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yes, I would, from an academic perspective, because I think it's a good example of how celebrity text is kind of manufactured and maintained, and how it speaks to a lot of the different themes that we've spoken about of like capitalism and gender and like kind of party politics, and how that is kind of enmeshed with celebrity. But from a fan perspective, probably not, because I think that it doesn't go into enough depth.
India, what do you think? Would you recommend this as someone who hasn't really had much exposure to Taylor Swift before?
I would recommend the documentary. I was actually going to recommend it to my mum last night on the phone. I was going to say, you should listen to this. I feel like you'd quite like it. But I'm not a Taylor Swift fan. Maybe I should be now. Maybe I should learn a bit more about the Taylor Swift lore. But I would recommend it to other people. But then again, I haven't seen other documentaries that you know are around other pop stars and celebrities, so I don't really know in comparison with those. But yeah, I would recommend it. I think you do get an insight into her life, but I also think you sort of, it feels like you've been with her on this journey, but also you haven't. It's like you've been you're there, but you're not quite actually being accepted into like her reality, like what's actually happening around her. You're just kind of shown what she wants you to see.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen how she got to where she is as well, like through the gigs in Nashville and the story of how she got to where she is today. I think actually that's what the documentary I may be in is going to look at. So maybe that'd be quite interesting. But like, and also like the process of why she decided to re-record her music and what that means to her. You know, stuff like that I think could have been so much more interesting than quite like contrived, I don't know.
So more than like sort of surface level.
Yeah, quite contrived moments.
Well, I guess sort of the last question for today then is if they made an Eras Tour documentary, which I assume they probably are putting something together, is that something that you would like to see in that film?
Yes, I think that would be great, actually. An Eras Tour documentary would be really interesting because I think the Eras Tour is kind of like a monumental feat of live performance in many ways. Like, it's 3 hours. I mean, all the stuff that I do find really fascinating, how she, you know, the Taylor Swift workout, have you heard of this? Where you run on so to train for the Eras Tour, because it's so kind of physically demanding, she ran on a treadmill at full speed for 3 hours and sang the songs at the top of her lungs for 3 hours.
gosh.
So that is actually like so interesting. But also like I think that she does also kind of drip feed this information to the media because there is a construction of her as a hard worker, which I don't get me wrong, I think is true, but it also kind of plays into this idea of her as like a kind of relatable friend who's a really hard worker. And there's a really good paper, again I can't remember who it's by, but it's by but it talks about her as like a zany hard worker, and that's kind of her celebrity image. But I would love to see in the Eras tour, like how that all came together, like the construction of it creatively, her ideas and like how they fed into it, and the kind of the set design is like really amazing. Don't know if you guys have seen much about it, but it like
Yes, it's such a cultural moment, I think.
Yeah.
Just the whole thing from the craze of people getting tickets to sort of revisiting all the different eras or times of Taylor Swift through each of her albums. It's such an interesting concept. And I get financially why it's been a huge success, but I think just culturally as well, the time that it's come out where I think it's when she's been almost the most criticized by even her fans in terms of like her environmental impact and everything else, but also sort of celebrating her whole sort of life as an artist. I think it's just a very interesting combination. I think India, if an Eras tour documentary came out, would you watch that?
I think I probably would. Yeah, maybe.
I think as a, even if you don't like Taylor Swift, I think that the set design alone is interesting. I think also there's a YouTuber I really like called The Swiftologist, and he's great.
Very nice.
Sorry. Sorry, end of term. I'm so sorry. Cut that out. He does like kind of long form video analysis, and he talks about Taylor Swift a lot. He also does like a lot of stuff on like Lana Del Rey and Ariana Grande. He's really brilliant. I actually want to get him to do a guest lecture over Zoom because he's really, really interesting. But he talked about how, she's kind of too big to fail now, because like there was a lot of questions of like, is she overexposed in the same way that she was around the 1989 era, which led to the kind of downfall of the Kanye West, Kim Kardashian downfall, where she was everywhere and people were kind of sick of her. And he kind of talked about how she's too big to fail now, which I think is actually very interesting. I don't know if I agree with it. I think that she is overexposed. I do think people are starting to get a bit sick of her. But I think that's a very interesting idea of her being too big to fail. I think it was a mistake to announce this latest album so soon, because I think she should have gone away for a year and then come back. I think I think in the way that Beyonce does, Beyonce kind of goes away, comes back with an album.
Yeah.
I think that maybe, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I'd definitely check out The Swiftologist if you're interested. He does a long form critique of Miss Americana that's basically kind of makes some of the points that we just made.
I'll
Yeah.
have to take a look at that as well. Well, Millie, thank you so much for coming on today. I think it was a really insightful look at the documentary, but also at Taylor Swift sort of as a celebrity figure as well. We can find more about your research, I think, on Exeter Comms. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if you go onto the communications website, or the University of Exeter Communications, on my staff profile, there's a lot of stuff about my research. So I look at Taylor Swift. I've just submitted a paper on that, obviously. But I also write a lot about austerity in reality television, and I'm working on a book proposal at the moment for a book about communes and cults. So that should be interesting. I kind of have quite sporadic interests, but kind of what kind of grounds my research interest is kind of looking at how popular culture and capitalism interact, and how, because I come from a political science background, so I kind of bridge the gap, I suppose, between like media studies and political science. So I'm very interested in like how the economy is reflected in popular culture in various ways. So yeah, working on this book project that hopefully my friend and I, Catherine Oliver, she works on like vegan activism. We're hopefully going to be able to like kind of go around communes and kind of look at like people who have removed themselves or tried to remove themselves from capitalism.
All right, well, it'll be really interesting to see how that turns
That
out.
sounds awesome.
Be watching for that.
Yeah.
That's all for today. So thank you, everyone, for listening to Cine-Mess, Embracing Bad Cinema. We've had Millie Morris on today from Exeter Communications. We've also had myself, Jess, and
India.
thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye.